Alright. Bom dia ao meu canal, seu canal, ao nosso canal, policial brasileiro na Flórida. E aqui com a prometida entrevista com o advogado de imigração, Nayef Mubarak. E o prazer de estar com você. E essa entrevista vai ser conduzida em inglês e eu vou estar traduzindo para vocês no vídeo que vai estar seguindo, tá? I told them, attorney, good morning. How are you, sir?
Great. I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Good. I was telling my crowd here that the interview is going to be done in English, and I will be captioning the interview for them in Portuguese so they can get a better understanding.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys, but yeah, hopefully the Portuguese translation will be good.
Good. So before we start, can you tell us, the Brazilian community, a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Nayef Mubarak. I'm an attorney in Orlando, Florida, but I specialize in immigration, and that is federal law. So I represent people all over the country and all around the world because with the Florida license, you can represent people wherever in federal law. I was born in New York, but my parents are immigrants. Most of my family members are immigrants, and I've grown up in Orlando for the last 30-something years. So I've seen our Brazilian community grow to what it is now. We have wonderful friends and family and even coworkers. So I'm happy that Officer Fabio is doing this. I think this is a great opportunity to educate everybody, and it's really important that everybody has the education and tools necessary to learn so they could avoid unfortunate situations. But I've been practicing immigration for over 14 years. I speak Arabic, Spanish, and English. I'll work on Portuguese, I promise. And my office also handles car accidents in addition to immigration. But with immigration, we are full service. So we'll handle things EB2 NIW, family sponsorship, work, or deportation defense. So that's what we do in our office. And if you have any questions, you just let us know.
That's amazing. And you said 30 some odd years, so we have something in common. I've been in the United States and in Florida my whole life for approximately 34 years.
Yeah, so we've seen the big changes.
Yes, very much so. So as we get started, I think the first question that comes to mind is you explaining this new immigration bill that is now taking effect, if I'm mistaken, on the 1st. So in a couple
that's right.
It's going to go into effect. Can you explain a little bit about details about this bill?
So this is the bill that everybody knows as Senate Bill SB 1718, and there's several immigration consequence enforcement issues for the state of Florida, and where they're going to either affect families with driving or with employment or even seeking medical attention. So we'll try to break it down for you. But this bill has been signed into law, so it's now Florida law effective July 1st, but we will continue to refer to it as SB 1718. Now, some of it originally started very scary, so there was a lot of drafts, meaning different when they were working to create the final version, where many people got a hold of it, and now you have a lot of misinformation on the internet. The original bill is nothing like the final one, so it's a lot less scary, and there's some things you need to know that might help people calm down, because you don't want to react to something or live in fear for something that might not even affect you. One of those things that I've seen very often, I don't know, officer, do you want me to go through the different elements that we talked about on the SB 1718?
Yes, sir. That'd be great.
Yeah. So one of the things that we see is this: am I going to get arrested if I'm driving with my husband or wife who doesn't have papers? So this is probably the scariest headline most people have seen. This is what a lot of you are concerned about. So let's break that portion down. This final version of the bill that was signed into law talks about transportation of undocumented individuals across state lines. So as if you're bringing somebody from Texas, Louisiana, Georgia to Florida. So this, if you're driving around locally, it's unlikely that you're going to have an issue with that. Moreover, it talks about, specifically defines the undocumented alien. So in the law, they define what does that mean. And in this law, they're talking about individuals who entered the country unlawfully. So for anybody who came with a visa or overstayed, this does not even apply to them. This is talking about individuals who's crossed the border and you're now bringing them over state lines. So if your spouse or child or friend crossed through Mexico and is now present here and you're driving between Georgia and Florida, yes, maybe it's possible you will have a problem. We'll talk about enforcement issues, but for the most part, driving around with family here, I don't believe that is going to be an issue unless you're driving buses or vans of people over state lines. The other things that we saw in this bill and that we're going to talk about further is the effect on employment and employers, these companies, the consequences they're going to face for having individuals who work for them without status. And then there was even some hospital provisions about what the hospitals must ask of individuals before they give them treatment. And finally, another important thing that we saw here is the driver's license, right? Florida, you need a driver's license to drive around. This is a part of our life. It's very difficult to function without one. So that's another component there. Then when we can break that down as well.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll add to that from a law enforcement perspective. I just listening to you and looking at the whole thing, it's almost like this bill is more focused on the human trafficking aspect of it, right? It's not from a law enforcement perspective locally. There's been no order for law enforcement to crack down on individuals, ask these type of questions when conducting a traffic stop. And it would have it, like we were talking before the video, even it would discourage people to come to law enforcement for assistance of any type, or even to assist law enforcement if that kind of crackdown which starts to happen. And that's totally something that we're not looking to do, because we want to be part of the community. We want to be able to work with the community to prevent crime and to crack down on crime. So I think
that's a big. You're absolutely right. I think that there is an issue for human trafficking. I think a lot of this is about news and headlines and scaring people. And that's what it's doing. If it's meant to scare people, it's getting the job done, right? Because you're scared, I'm scared, people who are citizens are scared for their neighbors and their friends. So I think a lot of this is going to have effect as far as scaring people. But what Officer Fabio is talking about is this going to be actually enforceable? Like, they haven't received instructions. How can you actually know which individuals in the car and just pull them over without racial profiling, right? So even if you do get pulled over and if you get charged, I think there's going to be a lot of challenges. Well, why did you pull them over? Is it because they're brown? Is it because they look like me? Is it because they look like somebody else? What is the reason of pulling somebody over if they weren't doing anything wrong, especially if you're not at a state border? So I think there's big issues with enforcement. I don't know how they're going to do that. Do you think that they're going to spend money on this kind of issues or these stops? Do you think that's typically your agency's priority?
No, definitely not. Whenever we're making any kind of big changes in regards to policy or something that we're going to do on the road, involving the community, involving the drivers around town, whatever it is, anytime we're making changes from a law enforcement perspective, these changes, these new policies come down the pipeline way beforehand so we can get educated with it. We haven't seen a thing. That tells me that it's business as usual. We're going to treat everybody the way we have been treating, with kindness, with professionalism, and holding people accountable whenever we need to. But what I mean by that is when we see crime. This is, we know people are driving. If you're driving without a driver's license, could you be, dealing with that consequences of having no driver's license? Of course, so that's right. Something completely separate. But are we going to ask you your status? Are we going to ask you for your passenger status? That doesn't apply. That's not what we're there for. We're conducting a traffic stop based on whatever reason. Maybe, you must have committed some kind of traffic violation, because there has to be probable cause for a police officer to stop you. And once that takes place, and there's no driver's license place, we'll handle that accordingly. But nothing else has been instructed for law enforcement to look into.
Right. And I think that's the thing is how, if they're not receiving the training, and this is not like the sky is falling, July 1st means they're grounding everybody up and saying, okay, we're going to get you out of here. It doesn't work that way. And it's really important to understand that Florida cannot deport you, right? Florida can penalize you criminally, but they are not in charge of immigration laws. That belongs to the federal government. And most people here, if you're out of status, or if you've been out of status for a certain amount of time, you have rights. So yes, you might end up in detention, but you have most of the time right to see an immigration judge, and you're never going to just be put on a plane until there's been a final decision on your case. And that can take numerous times. And I want to circle back to Officer Fabio made a comment about, yes, they treat our law enforcement is great in Central Florida, and they treat people with respect. But if you are violating the law, like driving without a license, you will get a ticket or arrested, possibly, depending on where you are. So driving without a license is something I tell clients all the time is the fastest way to get in trouble with immigration. So if you don't have a license, please do your best to Uber, make arrangements, find a job or something you could walk to, because that is the fastest way to get in trouble with immigration if you don't have status. So one of the parts of the bill talks about they're no longer going to accept licenses outside of the state of Florida if that license is specific for undocumented people. What does that mean? Let's say in Florida, we have strict rules about how to get a driver's license, but you went to New York or Massachusetts where they have driver's license specifically for undocumented people. If that's your driver's license from a state like New York or Massachusetts and it's for undocumented people, it will not be considered valid here. And that's what that law is saying with that. So that is going to affect, obviously, probably hundreds of thousands of people. But like I said, you have to make arrangements as far as the driving without the license, and hopefully consult with a different attorney or with our office, whoever you feel comfortable with, to see what options you have and to separate the noise of what's true and what's not true. Because everything on TikTok is not true. Just because on Instagram it's not true. Don't believe what I say. Do your research and make sure that you understand what it is people are saying.
Can I expand on what you said about the driver's license? And this is from a law enforcement perspective.
Sure.
The out-of-state driver's license, if you have two residences, let's say you're visiting Florida or you have a residence in Florida, right? You're an immigrant, but you live in a state that allowed you to get a driver's license, okay? And you have that state's driver's license. From what I've seen on the street while on patrol, there's nothing on that license that tells me that is a driver's license specifically for an immigrant. It pulls up just like a normal driver's license. Sometimes Florida one will show non-U.S. citizen, things like that. But it doesn't say that you qualify because you're an immigrant and you qualified under whatever specific law. It just says maybe you're a non-U.S. citizen. With an out-of-state license, if I have a residence in two states, I have a residence in Massachusetts and I have one in Florida, I don't have to necessarily, because I go back and forth, I can simply justify that I live in both places. Therefore, I just keep my driver's license from wherever I'm at, and I'm here temporarily visiting Florida, and eventually I'm like a snowbird type of attitude where, I go back over the summertime, back upstate, and then I'm back during the winter time. What do you see? Do you see an issue with that?
Yeah. Two very important points to what you're saying is, sometimes people have a Massachusetts driver's license. They get pulled over. The officer asks them, "Where do you live?" And they're going to say Kirkman, right? And then they're like, "Well, why do you live in Kirkman?" And with the Massachusetts driver's license, you're kind of doing all that. Now, we want to be truthful. You don't want to lie to an officer. You don't want to make things worse. But if you do have a home in Massachusetts, then you should explain, "Hey, I have a home there. I'm visiting my house here for temporary reasons or for a certain amount of time." You have to sometimes, they might not ask enough questions. So you might to know that they want to know, do you reside in Florida or do you reside in Massachusetts? Because that will determine whether or not you're driving with a valid license. So number two, I think this provision of the bill is also talking about sometimes people try to bring their driver's license from Massachusetts or New York, go to the DMV here and try to change it to a driver's license like that. And of course, that's not going to fly with the Florida government at all. And that's what I think most of this issue is saying. So Officer Fabio is making a great point with the, if you have an address in New York or Massachusetts to support your driver's license from those states, then you need to make sure that you vocalize that. A lot of it can be scary to be pulled over by an officer, but you need to be able to communicate with them, because that's going to determine whether or not you're getting ticketed or arrested.
Yeah, and I address a lot of these concerns in case you get pulled over by an officer and you're non-U.S. citizen and you find yourself in different situations, even without a driver's license. How should you react? And there's other videos of, addressing that within the channel. But in regards to people that are already under some type of immigration process, for example, DACA, whatever other immigration process, I'm sure you handle it too, U visa, right?
Right.
There's so many types of immigration process that people go through. If they find themselves in that type of process, do you see any changes for them under this bill?
I don't. I think this bill is really targeting people who have no status or no application at all and who entered the country unlawfully, right? So, yes, there's people who have entered the country unlawfully and might have pending asylum, right? And you have proof of documentation. I'm not saying just because you entered the country illegally or through Mexico that you're bad or that you don't have any claims. You might have an asylum claim. But what I'm saying is the way the law describes who qualifies under this SB 1718 is specifically to those who have traveled through the border as far as transporting an undocumented person. Now, with DACA or people who are pending, they're typically able to get a driver's license. So if you have an application in process or you have an application pending, that is usually a positive way to the right direction to get your driver's license. And that's really important because, like I said, I'm going to keep saying it because I want people to learn, is that they're getting pulled over without a license is the fastest way to end up in deportation proceedings oftentimes. And not because driving is so bad, it's just because you kind of expose yourself and you're being discovered.
Okay. Expanding a little bit on this topic, if you have a worker permit, I think I hear your answer already, but I'm going to ask it anyways. If I find myself with a worker's permit in the United States, here in Florida specifically, does this law apply in any way for us?
I don't believe so. This law is affecting those who don't have work authorization. And with work authorization and a valid ID, you can usually get a Florida driver's license without any issues.
So from a different perspective, for the people that are currently working in the state of Florida and do not have a worker's permit, how does this bill affect them?
Right. So working without status is not lawful by any means, but it's not typically criminalized, right? So you can't usually go to jail in most cases for working without status. But this bill is seeking to, or this law rather, is seeking to penalize employers who don't have employees with status. So new companies with more than 25 employees are going to have to register or show that all of their employees have status. If they are unable to do so, they will start to receive penalties and fines, and in some cases lose their permits to practice like whatever they're doing, like construction. So this is going to affect employers big time, I think, more than individuals, which I think is going to have some backfiring on the state of Florida when we have so much construction, because we're such a place everyone wants to be and is growing so fast. And if many of our workers are leaving, these companies are not going to be happy, right? So this is something that we're going to see. That's how it's going to balance out, and then maybe not be enforced. So time will only tell, really, for those.
Are you going to find that employers are going to keep it under the 25 just to get around it?
I think so. You might have to open 10 companies with 23 employees instead of one company with 250, right? So who knows where the loopholes are? And, that's a lot of different ways people are going to do things. Just like every law, there's going to be trial and error. Like the government's going to try things, companies are going to try things, and then it's going to see where the dust settles.
All right. And one question that comes to mind before we end, and thank you so much for your time. So with all this explanation of the law, what happens if I do get arrested during this time? What can be the possible consequences that you see with this new law?
So typically when you do get arrested and you're not a U.S. citizen, the state authorities will usually notify the ICE agency, who will then determine whether or not they should put an ICE hold, right? A hold is not allowing this person to be released. So God forbid a family member is arrested. and you want to pay a bond, but you see federal hold, don't pay that bond yet, because you want to speak to an immigration lawyer, because that means even if you pay the state bond, like $2,000, they're not going to get out if there's a federal hold. So one, we have to preserve the money we have because we're about to go through some legal balance. Two, we don't want to expedite. And what I mean by that is once you pay the state bond, that gives ICE typically 48 hours, working hours, to come visit the individual and determine if they will release them or take them to an ICE facility, right? So these are things that we kind of have to plan. So if you are living undocumented, I tell people you need to have an emergency contact who has copies of all of your documents, the scanned birth certificates of children, if you own property. These are all things an immigration lawyer like me is going to need if I need to try to get you out of an immigration detention facility. So you need to have an emergency contact, prepare for the worst. It's scary to think about, but that's a reality of your situation if you don't have status here. You should have a consultation with an attorney when things are good, not when things are bad, so you know what to expect in the future, kind of like what we're talking about right now. You need to tell the truth to the officers, but you don't want to sign anything you don't understand. So if you receive documents or they're telling you to sign something, you need to insist on having an interpreter or a translator. Otherwise, that can definitely be used against you. And these are kind of some small things that will make a bad situation a little bit easier if you prepare for them ahead of time. And just because you are transferred to an immigration facility, or just if ICE takes you from the Florida prison, that doesn't mean you're being put on a plane. There's very few circumstances where you're being put on a plane immediately. That typically means you've already been deported, you have an exceptional amount of felonies, and you're like a danger to this country. But for people who've never seen an immigration judge, you have the right to due process, and you will see a judge, and we would have time to try to fight for your case in most cases. So that's what I would say to people who are being arrested, to prepare for those things and to make sure you have a family member or a contact who can access your documents, your home, and the information we need. I need things like your date of birth, how many children, when did you come, what proof do I have that you've been here for 5 years or for 10 years. So you have to always plan for worst case scenario, kind of like an insurance. If something bad happens, then your family member can get a hold of me or any attorney, and they have the access to the documents they need. Because if you're the only one who knows where the documents are and you're in jail, what good does that do anybody?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in the word that I've already talked to a few people, Brazilians that have approached me and asked about this topic. And the thing that I keep saying, the word that I keep using is don't panic.
Right.
Do you agree with that? Yeah, it is. It can be scary. I've been in this position. I've been an immigrant in this country before I became legalized. Yeah. So, and at the time, there were so many things that would come out and people would start panicking. Oh my God, immigration is going to show up at the job. Immigration is going to do this. I tell people don't panic. From a legal perspective, what do you tell people in regards to this and not to panic?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Right now, we don't know what things are going to look like. You can prepare, you can educate yourself, but July 1st doesn't mean they're knocking on your door, right? There's nothing like that happening. And that's what I agree with you. Like the Brazilian community, the Middle Eastern community, everybody has this like looming doom that somehow at midnight, everything is going to go crazy. No. So don't make any decisions that are hasty. Like I said, educate yourself. Knowledge is power. And that's how you're going to be able to protect yourself. And you'll see in 6 months, if it's as bad as we think it, you are, then you make those decisions. But time will only tell. A lot can happen. We can change politicians. They can change the law. We can decide that some agencies must say, we're not going to enforce this at all. So educate yourself. The sky's not falling, as Officer Fabio said, and just try to be prepared for a worst case scenario.
All right. And if the Brazilian community have any more questions, where can they find you, sir?
Yes, please. We would be happy to help. My office, we speak Portuguese, Spanish, Haitian Creole, French, Arabic, and English. So we're happy to help. MubarakLaw.com, or please follow me on social media. Nayef Law or Mubarak Law, and we tend to do a lot of information out there. So we actually will do myth debunking, and you follow our social media, and hopefully that will be helpful for you as well. And thank you for having me, Officer Fabio. I think that what you're doing is an incredible way to enforce the law, is to also educate the people. And when you educate people, it helps you enforce the law and prevent people from avoiding mistakes that they could have avoided. So thank you for what you're doing and your service, putting your life on the line every day. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do. I appreciate your time, and we'll be talking.
All right, you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.